Who's jealous? What?
Everything ready for Sunday.
Okay.
It's informal. I'm sorry. It's formal.
No, it's formal.
It's a real wedding. What do you want?
Yes, comfortable.
Like short.
No.
Flip-flops.
Coming to Senegal, I like
Yeah.
rabbi. It's perfect.
Well, I'll be wearing a suit and tie on
Yeah,
Sunday.
but you're present. And so will you, son. I love the way.
Okay, so we are going to pick up now with Rosh Hashanah, chapter 1, Mishnah 1. But a reminder that we don't have class next week. And in fact, we don't have class anytime in June. And in fact, we don't have class on the first week of July because that's July 4th. So we're going to...
Of course, Natalia is not here. That's why. Thank you, Robert.
So we're going to study tonight, and then you're going to have to keep reviewing or read ahead. Remember, you can always go to USCJ, United Synagogues of Conservative Judaism, and get the full text in advance. You don't have to wait for me, and study. And then we'll pick up with wherever we leave off when I get back. So that'll be, I think, July 6th or something. No, July 4th, 9th.
The 10th.
No, 11th, isn't it? July 4th plus 7 would be 11th.
It's July 4th is Tuesday. Okay.
July 4th is the Wednesday.
Oh, wow.
Well,
Let
I
me
have it back on the 3rd, so it should
Yeah,
go.
it's on a Wednesday. So it's the 11th. Yes, Rabbi,
You
you're
decided
correct.
to go?
July 11th, yeah. So we study tonight.
Going right into Gaza. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's quiet.
It's quiet for now.
You don't time your trips to Israel based on the news, right? It's
Yeah.
you go to Israel when you need to be in Israel, and when you want to be in Israel, and whatever is happening, it'll take care of itself.
That's
You know,
how-
Yihetov,
He
right?
knows how to handle a gun.
Okay, but for now, we're going to begin with Rosh Hashanah. So hopefully, even with our little break, we'll still be able to finish Rosh Hashanah before Rosh Hashanah.
Oh, cool.
I have confidence because this first chapter, which we're planning to do tonight, it's not too complicated. I think it'll be pretty straightforward. One little bit of calendar work. Lunchtime. When is Rosh Hashanah in the Jewish calendar? What's the date?
Tishrei,
Tishrei what?
14th, no,
Aleph.
first.
Allah, thank you.
Tishrei first.
Tishrei, or sometimes you'll see it spelled Tishri. Either is fine. So it's the first day of Tishrei. Here in the diaspora, we have to celebrate it for two. But even in Israel, Rosh Hashanah is the only holiday that gets celebrated for both first and second day of Chag, because, and this is going to be important for some of our later Mishnayot, which is where I wanted to get it out in the open, because of the moon, right? How do you know what day it is? Well, nowadays I do this, right? And then I know what day it's supposed to be. Back in the ancient world, and also in the classic world, even after the temple was destroyed, how did you know when a month started? The moon. But it wasn't just the moon. You know, each person looked up at the moon and said, oh, it's the new month. There had to be an official sighting. There had to be official witnesses who were officially investigated and who had to give official testimony at the official court, at the Sanhedrin or the replacement courts after the temple was destroyed. And they had to be examined to make sure they were correct. And then, yes, you would say, "Ba-ba, this is the new moon, right? This is the new day." Now, even if you didn't see it on the first day, you knew it had to come by the second day. So you only had a 2-day window that you had to worry about, because you knew when the last moon was, because you were there. So this moon sighting is why on Rosh Hashanah, you can't sit there waiting, wondering, is today Rosh Hashanah or not, until somebody actually spots the moon. And so you would do Rosh Hashanah on both days just to be sure that you had actually covered it. Also, if you lived outside of Israel, even if they were able to identify the new moon right as Rosh Hashanah was beginning, yes, it's just about evening time and there comes the new moon, how are you going to get the message out to everyone else?
But both days also count like a one day.
What do you mean?
Rosh Hashanah, the both day is not like a Yom HaRosh. It's not like only one day. It's
Well, I mean,
by 2 days.
it ends up being like a long day, but and each day is the same for most of the liturgy, but things like the Torah reading is different, and things like that. So that we end up with two very good parshiot by having it done that way. But that is the only holiday that we do, even in Israel, as 2 days, because when you rely on the moon sighting, you have to delay and be careful because you don't know when their information is going to reach everyone.
You know, by the way, sorry.
It's okay.
When,
Tangents are good.
Which day of the week is for the?
This year,
Just curious.
off the top of my head, is it a Sunday this year again? Just a second. There we go. Nope. Yes, no, it is. It's Sunday night.
So it's
Sunday night, the 9th this year. September 9th.
Saturday night, Sunday night will be Monday and Tuesday.
Yes. Yeah, I know.
Beginning of the year.
Right after Labor Day. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 days off. Yeah, great.
Yeah. Fits in perfect as a teacher, right? Yeah. The worst possible.
No, the fight with my daughter, I can see.
Ah. You know, when I was a kid, just as an aside, when my mom told us, oh, Rosh Hashanah, Monday or Tuesday, oh, good, I get to miss school. But the kids today, they don't want to miss school because they're,
I don't know what's wrong with them.
no, it's because they're paranoid. They know that if they miss school, they're going to miss learning. If they miss learning, they're going to get bad test scores. And to get bad test scores, they're going to be living in a car under a bridge for the rest of their life. That's what they imagine.
They are afraid of the makeup or a lot of material.
Yes. And it's actually, in my opinion, a little sad because they feel such pressure. And even if the parents aren't giving it to them, they just feel this pressure that they can't miss a day. And it's not healthy. But I'll get off the soapbox and go back to teaching Mishnah. Right? You didn't hire me to talk about schools. You hired me to talk about Mishnah. Okay, so with this in mind, the first of Tishrei is when Rosh Hashanah begins. But when is Tishrei? What month is it? Right, like January, is the first month, and September is the 9th month.
Depending from whom, because
there is no depending.
No, for the Torah is the 7th month.
Exactly. No, there is no other.
Okay.
There is no other, right? Tishrei is
The 7th.
the 7th month.
Yeah.
And how it can be the 7th month, but the beginning of the year is going to be the subject of our very first Mishnah.
But this one is the first one.
Yes.
As we're going to find out in our first Mishnah.
That's right.
Right? Okay, so chapter 1, Mishnah 1. I think they're going to make you volunteer.
Yes. There are 4 new years.
What? There are 4 new years? No. A new year is a new year is a new year, right?
For the trees.
You reading ahead?
No,
Okay, but before we read further, I just want to make you understand this is not so crazy, right? Who here has a birthday? Right? Who here actually counts their birthday still? Well, maybe not everybody, but isn't that your own counting? Right? Isn't that a different new year for you? Right? Your birthday is a personal new year, right? What about an anniversary?
Yeah.
That's a personal new year.
And you have the birthday for the Gregorian calendar or for the Jewish calendar.
And you can have birthdays and anniversaries on both Gregorian and Hebrew calendars, but the point is that it's a personal new year. And what about if you're in like a particular business? They might have a fiscal year that maybe it's January to January, but sometimes it's off. And then you have the tax year, which goes until April and things like that. So and then you have, talking to the teacher, the school year, right? And the school year goes from usually August until May or June. It goes right through the middle of January,
Soccer season.
right? So if you say, what's the 3rd month to a teacher, the teacher may be counting from August rather than counting from January. So the idea that there are 4 new years in Judaism sounds really bizarre, but it's actually very natural and normal, and we do the exact same thing. We just don't call them new years, and that's why we don't understand that what they're talking about is perfectly normal.
Actually, for teachers, June is Nisan.
June is Nisan. June is the beginning because you finish.
No, it's Yetzer Nisan.
Ah. Okay, so there are 4 new years. Let's find out about them.
The first of Nisan is the new year for kings and for festivals.
Okay, and the most famous holiday, of course, is the holiday of Pesach, which comes during that time period, which, as was mentioned, is Yetziat Mitzrayim, is the exodus from Egypt. It's also the exodus from winter.
Oh, yeah. The first of Elul is the new year for the tithe of feasts.
All right, so if you have to decide whether this baby goat counts as part of this year's tithe or next year's tithes. Those that are born before Elul are in this year, and those that are born after Elul are in the next year's category.
Remind me again of
Elul is the month right before Tishrei. Right, it's the month before Rosh Hashanah.
I was thinking it was after Nisan.
Well, it is, but not immediately. That's you're thinking ER.
Oh, okay.
Right, similar vowels. Yes.
Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say the first of Tishrei.
Right, so they argued about the beast tithing. They said no, it's not Elul. It's actually Tishrei. They lose.
The first of Tishrei is the new year of 4 years.
Which is what we would call the calendar year.
For Shemitah and Jubilee years.
You know how when we talk about for 6 years you work the land and for 7 years you let it lie rest. When does the clock start and stop? On Rosh Hashanah, right? Not on Passover, but on Rosh Hashanah. So when you have to every 49 years do the Jubilee, the Yovel, and you set free all of the indentured servants and all of that, that's happening during Tishrei. It's not happening during Pesach.
For planting and for tithe of vegetables.
Right, so for counting when something was it planted last year or was it planted this year?
Is that counting? Also, no, that's only vegetables. That's not counting. Oh, the trees is next.
That exactly. That's coming up next for the specific things for the tree. But we did need to know for trees as well for their own special counting of Orla, but we're not there yet.
But what's the difference between this one and the next one?
This
here is also for planting the trees. Come in the first of Tishrei, but also first of Shvat, you count also the years for the trees. So what's the difference between both?
This one is just vegetable.
I don't know.
No. So So what we're talking about is the Tishrei trees is talking about the age of the tree. The Tu B'Shvat tree, which is what the next section is talking about, is talking about the fruit of the tree. Right? Which year did the fruit come in? Was the fruit from last year or from this year? And that's why, well, actually, go ahead and read part 4, or else it makes no sense.
And the first of Shabbat is the new year of trees, according to the words of Bet Shammai.
He loses. Well, they lose.
But Hillel says on the 15th of that month.
And what do we call the 15th of Shvat? Tu B'Shvat. Right? So that's the word tu isn't really a word. It's the number of Tet and Vav, which added together is 15. So it's like trying to make a word out of 1 5. It's coming up with the word. So in Tu B'Shvat is when you draw the line between the produce of the trees. But on Tishrei is when you draw the age of the trees. Because you have to wait the number of years, as we've talked about, before you can pick and, well, first you have to bring the first fruits to the temple, and then after that you would bring them to your own table. Okay, so we've got 4 different New Years. Not surprisingly, then, we're also going to have a concept of 4s, because the Mishnah likes to have groupings that are similar, but these are for other types of things.
At 4 set times, the world is judged. One on Pesach is in respect to the produce.
All right, so produce, the actual bounty of your harvests, and that's really talking about your grain type harvests. This is being determined at Pesach, right? That is when you get the decree, if you will, of how good the produce is going to be this year. And that makes a lot of sense because the barley is just beginning to come in, and the wheat is, 50 days off for the holiday of Shavuot, which is what's going to tie us to the next one.
On Shavuot, in respect to the fruit of the tree.
Right, because this is when you would really beginning to see the fruit taking shape, and you would have a good estimate of how good is the fruit harvest going to be this year, especially of grapes.
On Rosh Hashanah, all the people of the world pass before him like a division of soldier and numerous, as it says, he who fashions the hearts of them all, who discerns all their doings. All right,
so this is where we get the idea that we get grain judgment in Pesach and fruit judgment in Shavuot and people judgment at Rosh Hashanah. This is why Rosh Hashanah is Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. Judgment Day. I mean, I know they make that all sound, horrible in movies and everything. But when we talk about Judgment Day here, we're not talking about, angels and demons fighting and all that nonsense. We're talking about the judgment of how good of a person have you been, and what are you going to do to fix your mistakes.
That sentence is not part of the Matokef.
Unatana Tokef.
It's not the sentence. It's not part of the Unatana Tokef.
It is, no, the sentence
About
we
walk as a sheep.
Yes. So precisely, no, but as a paraphrase, yes. Unatana Tokef uses this imagery and the development in the Gemara as its foundation for its poetry. It's not. It wasn't created by the author of Unatana Tokef. He was using these passages as his inspiration for elaborating on the imagery, because this image is a very powerful one, that everybody would parade before God, and that God would take notice of each of us. And that was really what this, as well as Unatana Tokef, is telling us, is that, well, let me back up. There has always been a philosophical debate in Judaism, and especially outside of Judaism, of how much God cares about the individual. And there have been some, in Judaism, a small minority, in other religions, sometimes a bigger minority, a bigger majority, that's especially among the philosophers, that God didn't care about individuals. Right? God cared about humanity, but God didn't care about an individual person. So whether you live or die, God doesn't care. As long as humanity lives, God was getting what God wanted, both within the Mishnah and the Gemara, and then also among the later poets, which is where Unatana Tokef really comes from. They said, no, God, like a shepherd, doesn't just care about the flock. He looks at each and every person. Each and every sheep matters to God. And that's what this imagery is meant to be driving home.
Was this a rabbinic evaluation? How did they come about that? Because I think it's absolutely right. Because in Psalms, it's when you think of David, he's always talking about, you are looking at me, not everybody, but just you're watching my steps. You're being my shepherd. You're protecting me. It's just so personal.
Where it came from is the idea among the small minority that disagree, was the idea that it seemed that God had a particular attention to particular people, to special people like David or like the prophets or obviously like Moses. But the rest of us, we were just part of the group. We were part of the general flock. And God made sure that certain people happened and succeeded or failed according to his plan, but the rest of us, we were background.
That's the minority.
That's the minority view. That's the minority view. The majority view, even among the philosophers like Rambam, is that no, God actually cares about humans individually. Among Rambam and others, they disagree about whether God cares about individuals among the other species. Right? Does God actually care what happens to this bug and that bug? Or does God just, say, whatever, as long as the bugs are around and doing what they should do, we're okay? And that's where the philosophers, even among ours, are more evenly divided. To say, not that God can't pay attention, but does God actually steer the path of the life of every individual bug and amoeba and, paramecium and there's a big debate still going on about that.
Yeah, because the problem is that if you don't say that God cares about each individual, it's very difficult to convince people to follow the mitzvot.
Yeah.
Because we say, well, you know what? Anyway, if you do or not, nothing happens. And you are in with the rest.
Okay, so that is part of it. It's not when the philosophers, the ones who are the minorities, said that God didn't care about the individual. They didn't mean that God didn't care about the individual. Of course, God wants you to be good, wants you to be happy, wants you to follow the mitzvot. But God was not steering the path of your life. You were sort of on your own. Well, it's not a question of leeway. It's more like you're on your own. You don't have more, not just more choice, but you have more room to stumble and more room to go in whichever direction you want to go. And if you do, it's not a catastrophe for God's plan, right? It's if I decide to go over here and murder someone, it doesn't stop Israel from becoming a nation. It doesn't stop Mashiach from coming, right? I'm just a guy. That's what the philosopher said, right? Most of the majority of our people have said, no, actually, God really does depend on each one of us to help move the game forward of the world. And therefore, God wants each one of us to keep moving, and he will continue to guide us individually as best as we can get in order for the cumulative. We still have free will, we still have choice, but there's more attention paid to each of us than there would be in the other. So, but you're right, it can be discouraging to think, well, I'm not Moses, so what does God care? But God still cared, it just wasn't, God wasn't focused. It's kind of like, think of it more like a CEO or a king, right? The king cares about his country, or the CEO cares about his country. Does the king know the name of every peasant? No, but he wants the peasants to be happy. He wants the peasants to have good laws. He wants the peasants to be safe. But he doesn't actually go and visit each house and see, tell me about your children, tell me about your farm, tell me about the trouble. No, the CEO or the king just makes general rules that help the little people. But the vice president, the CEO, really cares about the vice presidents. Are they good? Are they doing right? What are they doing for the people under? And that was the philosophy that others had. Like I said, that's a minority opinion. Most Jewish thinkers say, no, God actually does care about each and every one of us, because God can do that. The king can't, but God can. Make sense? Okay. And part 4?
And on Sukkot, they are judged in respect to rain.
Right. This is why we say the blessing for rain at that time, because it happens to be the rainy season. And rain is incredibly important in the land of Israel. It's a little annoying in the land of Florida. But in the land of Israel, it is incredibly important. All right.
The festival of Church for the Water is in Tishrei, but in the middle of Tishrei.
Yes, it's in the middle of Tishrei. It didn't say that it was at the start. It's saying there are 4 times when the world is judged. Okay. Chapter 1, Mishnah 3.
There are 6 months at the beginning of which messengers go out.
Okay. So, remember we talked a little bit about our moon sighting here, right? And I think you caught that when the moon happens, you got to send your runner to go tell people, hey guys, the moon came. That means it's going to be this new holiday. It's going to be a new month. Well, you need to send runners only like urgently sometimes during the year, right? On some months you can walk, but on other months you got to really send people, because there are holidays that depend on accurate calendars being sent out to everyone. And since they're sending the calendar every month, it's not like it's pre-printed. They need to know when to really send, and that's going to be even more important when we get into the next section. So there are 6 times when they really send these messengers out.
On Nisan, because of Pesach.
All right, so the start of Nisan, you got to send runners so people know when Pesach is going to be.
On Av, because of the fast.
Right, Tisha B'Av, 9 days later, you really got to hurry so that everyone knows when the when the day of Av is going to be commemorated.
On Elul, because of Rosh Hashanah.
Now, Rosh Hashanah is in Tishrei, but because it's the first of Tishrei, you have to send from the month before, so that way they'll know when the first of Tishrei is likely going to be, or the second, and so that way they can celebrate both days.
And also you need to start the baking during the whole
Cleaning.
Well, right, so you should be doing all of the slichot during Elul as well, the penitence, and tshuva, and all of those things. Those can actually begin unofficially without the announcement. You don't need to know the precise day, because everybody knew basically when the new month was going to be. You only needed the runner to tell you when precisely Pesach was going to be, precisely when Rosh Hashanah was going to be, and those kinds of things. So you could begin tshuva, begin doing your repentance earlier, and if you were off by a few days, God was not going to be upset, especially if you were a few days early. It's always a good time to repent.
Was it runners, or I heard that they would like the Indians, fires?
Gam v'gam, both.
Gam v'gam,
Yeah.
both of them.
So they would use signal fires for the nearby area, but that often would get messed up. So they'd have trouble with the Samaritans, for example, lighting the fires on the wrong days to deliberately trick people into thinking it was a different day. So the runners were the most reliable system for giving those messages. Yeah, when it worked, it was great. But when people got tricky, then it got annoying.
So why Shavuot is not so important there?
Ah.
Because it's one of the issues of
Like
the
Ali.
Why is Shavuot? Why not? Why is Shavuot not important? Why don't I need a runner for Shavuot? Right? Why don't I need a runner for
Because
Shavuot?
you have Pesach.
Because you have Pesach, and what comes right after? Sfirat HaOmer.
Yeah.
You have the counting of the
That's
Omer.
right, so they keep
You don't
track
need-
of that.
Right? You don't need
That's
Shavuot
right.
because as soon as Pesach starts, bam, you hit the stopwatch, and 1, 2, 3, and now I know precisely when Shavuot is coming. I don't need to look at the moon for Shavuot because the countdown from Passover, well, the count up, is going to lead me right to Shavuot perfectly every single time. So Shavuot is great because it's the one holiday that I don't need the moon to tell me because I've already got it if I knew when Passover was. So thank you. I almost skipped over that, but I wanted to mention that. So it
Good
was
one.
the perfect lead-in to that little bit. Now Tishrei,
On Tishrei, because of the setting of the festivals.
right? Because not just Rosh Hashanah, but for Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, you needed to have that anchor day.
And he will be announcing all of those.
Well, they'd be announcing this was the first day of the month,
Okay.
and that way you can do the math from that point forward.
On
Natan,
Kislev,
you got a question? Looked like you were, okay,
on Kislev because of Hanukkah.
right? You got to know when Hanukkah is, so you need to have that agreed,
And on Adar because of Purim.
and that's it, right?
So
So
6 of those.
no problem. However, there is a special one that used to be around when the temple was here.
When the temple stood, they used to also go out to report
ER,
ER because of Pesach Katan, Pesach Shini.
right?
But
So,
it's also the next month is 30 days.
but
It's a Rosh.
it's not. It's the 15th day of the next month. So the next month is not a perfect count. Sometimes, depending upon the moon sighting, it could be just a little bit less or just a little bit more. And so that's why they had to make the announcement. But since there is no temple, Pesach Sheni, the second makeup Passover, is not important. We can still do a lot of Pesach Rishon, the main Pesach, even without the temple, even without the sacrifice. But Pesach Sheni had no purpose except to make up for the missed sacrifice because of ritual impurity. So when the temple was destroyed, we didn't have to be so careful that we sent runners for that. Okay, and now to see exactly how important these messages were, well, chapter 1, Mishnah 4.
On account of 2 months, they profane Shabbat. On account of Nisan and Tishrei, for on those months messengers go forth to Syria, and in them the dates of the festivals are fixed.
Okay, so what this means here are witnesses, which means a witness who sees the new moon, right? Looks up in the sky and sees peeking through the cloud that new moon that's up there, and it's Shabbat. What's he supposed to do? Right? He can't walk all the way to Jerusalem on Shabbat. Right? On a regular Shabbat, that would be totally prohibited. But for these 2 months, yes, you are permitted to break Shabbat to bring your testimony to Jerusalem. Right? You can go ahead and travel on Shabbat past the Tichum, the Shabbat limit, the edge that you can't walk past on Shabbat. You can do that if you're bringing testimony about the new moon. Only, however, for Nisan and Tishrei, right? Because those months we've got to get the moon set and we got to get the word out to all the way to Syria, for example, as soon as possible, or else people won't be able to celebrate Pesach or Sukkot on the right days. Because remember, getting from Israel to Syria, it wasn't like now. Actually, now it takes a while too, unless you're in a F-35. Then it goes like that. They had to, go by foot usually, or maybe by horse, and you had to make sure that you had plenty of time to get there. So you could easily imagine someone leaving Jerusalem on the very first day and only just getting into Syria, 2 weeks later when it's time for the holiday. So it was important to make sure every day counted. And that meant even on Shabbat, you could walk to Jerusalem to give your testimony.
And by the way, Rabbi, were those people that were witnesses, were they rabbis as well? Did they
No.
have to have a position?
We're going to talk about who could be a witness in a few Mishnayot, so that's an excellent question. But the short answer for the moment is most people were valid witnesses for the moon.
Okay.
You didn't have to be special, but they would do a special test. They would hold up like cards of, did it look like this or did it look like that? In order to see whether the person really saw it.
Really?
In which Masechet we saw this before with Rabbi Gamliel?
Sanhedrin, I believe.
Sanhedrin.
Yeah. Okay, onward.
When the temple stood, they used to profane Shabbat for all the months in order that the sacrifice might be offered on the right day.
Okay, so
Interesting.
when the temple stood, you needed to offer a Rosh Chodesh sacrifice, which we still mention when we do our Musaf on Rosh Chodesh. Well, if the witnesses stayed home on Shabbat because they didn't want to come, and then they come, Motzei Shabbat, after Shabbat is over, well, we missed Rosh Chodesh, and now we can't do the sacrifice because you came late. So even on Shabbat, you were allowed to go to Jerusalem when the temple stood because they needed to know if they had to do Rosh Chodesh right then. And so, but once the temple was destroyed, we weren't doing the Rosh Chodesh sacrifice, then there wasn't the same pressure, and that meant you couldn't break Shabbat for that reason. Okay. Now we're going to get a really interesting sort of backwards thinking.
Whether the new moon was seen clearly or was not seen clearly, they profane Shabbat on account of it.
And go ahead and do Rabbi Yosef.
Rabbi Yosef says if it was been seen clearly, they do not profane Shabbat on account of it.
Okay. So this is where you have to sort of think to the left-hand side, right? Scratch your left ear with your right hand. If you're not sure, because the moon wasn't clear, then you do break Shabbat. But if the moon was easy to see, says Rabbi Yossi, you don't break Shabbat.
Yes, makes sense.
Because
if it's clear, more witness it will be.
Ah.
But if it's not clear,
Right.
very few.
if I can see it easily, then I assume everybody can see it easily, even the people who already live in Jerusalem, and they don't have to break Shabbat to go to the temple. So if I look up and I see bright, sliver of the moon in a clear night, I can stay home safe and sound, believing someone else has seen it in Jerusalem, and I'm fine. Whereas if I look up and I see, oh, look, there's the moon. Oh, the cloud just covered it. I've got to go to Jerusalem, even though it means going on Shabbat, because who knows if anyone else was looking up at the right time. The halakha rejects Rabbi Yossi and his beautiful logical reason. Because if you make that the rule, the Gemara says, then people will not come because they'll assume someone else saw it. Right? What? Exactly right. It's actually, there's a modern term for it in sociology and psychology called distributed responsibility. Right? The more people who could be responsible for something, the less chance there is something will get done. Right? I remember a great experiment where they would have people, the experimenters would get onto an elevator. And if there was one person and the experimenter would drop their folder. And so their folder and their papers would go across the floor. And the other person in the elevator always would bend down, pick it up, help them with all their papers. You get onto an elevator and there are 5 people and they drop it. Everybody just stands there while you pick it up. Because everyone looks around, they see that no one else is moving, and so they assume must not be our responsibility. When you're alone, you assume, in a place where there are no men, be a man, as the Pirkei Avot says. But when there's more people around, then you don't. So even though he makes a very logical point that if I could see it clearly, then other people could see it clearly, so why would I break Shabbat? If you follow that logic, you'd end up with not enough people going when they did see it because they'd assume, someone else probably saw it. So we move on now to Mishnah 6.
It happened that more than 40 pairs of witnesses were on their way to Jerusalem, and Rabbi Akiva detained them in the Lod.
In Lod, right? So outside of Jerusalem, there's a city called Lod, and Rabbi Akiva is there, and there are 40 pairs of witnesses. That means 80 people, which you only need 2 to make the testimony. And so Rabbi Akiva, this is still on Shabbat, says, no. We just need 2 of you guys, okay? We don't need 80 people to march to Jerusalem to all say, we all saw the moon. Like, you don't need an army. Just, yes, we have to break Shabbat to give the testimony, but we don't need to all break Shabbat to give the testimony. But
Rabban Gamaliel sent to him, saying, if you prevent the multitude from coming to provide testimony, it will turn out that you caused them to stumble in the future.
Right? So same idea. If you tell them, we don't need all of you, you're going to get none of them next month.
The next time.
Right? Because next month they're going to assume they don't need me. Someone else is probably already going.
Yeah.
On top of that,
So 80 more people will be
right, on top of that, as we're going to see, sometimes if you only have two witnesses, one of them may be disqualified. One of them may be invalid for some reason. One of them may have bad testimony, just incorrect. And now you've got no witnesses, not enough.
because then you need to.
You need two at least, exactly. So 80 may seem like an overkill, but you know, you don't want to stop them from trying to go, right? I mean,
Because
imagine.
all the zeal, they're very excited to do it.
I mean, imagine if we put someone at the front of the door, right? Or even better, imagine above the door we had a sign, and every time someone walked in, we put like a number up, and as soon as we hit 10, the sign would light up so that everyone knew we had a minyan. Do you think we would get more people or fewer people if they knew we had a minyan before they came in?
Less people.
You'd have fewer people because they would think, oh, they don't need me, right? Because people will do it if they think they're needed, but they'll sometimes not come, even if it's good for them, because they don't feel needed. As long as people say, well, I wonder if they have a minyan. I wonder if they need me. It's going to help encourage a few more people to come.
You're right.
Right, so it's putting a big sign up saying, we have a minyan, may sound like an invitation, but for many people it's going to say, we don't need you. And that's the wrong
Unfortunately,
message.
They're going to take it that way.
Unfortunately, exactly. It shouldn't work that way. It should be great. They've got a minyan. That means we're going to be able to read Torah and we're going to be able to do, you know, the Kedusha and all of that. But that's not the way everybody thinks. And it's great to know that at least 2,000 years ago, people were still the same, right? That if you told them, I don't need you this month, they're not going to come next month either. And so you just take them all and you never tell them you don't need them.
It's a famous story of a town, straight where they had 10 Jews,
Mhm.
never miss a minyan,
Yep.
never.
But only 10 Jews.
Only 10.
Right, perfect number.
Yes, so arrive a new one. So now they had a letter. Everyone said, oh, great, now I don't need to be there.
Right.
And never again they had a minyan.
Right.
No way.
Yeah. It's a great story. I love that story.
Oh,
And it's very psychologically true, right? If you feel that you are essential, then you'll get up there. It doesn't matter if it's raining, doesn't matter if it's cold, doesn't matter if you're not feeling great. If you know they need me, you will go. And if you think they don't really need me, what am I adding? They've got plenty of other people. You all of a sudden lose your strength and all of a sudden lose your determination. It's why everybody has to see themselves as being the important thing. As long as we're talking about Rosh Hashanah, we got a few minutes left. One of my favorite teachings in the Talmud about Rosh Hashanah is that on Rosh Hashanah, every person should imagine that their good deeds and their bad deeds are perfectly balanced.
Oh.
And that one more good deed will tip the scale in your favor. But the whole nation should also imagine that its deeds are perfectly balanced. In fact, the whole world should imagine that its deeds are perfectly balanced, which means one more good deed by one more person is all it takes to tilt the world to good. That's the power of one person. That's the power of one person's one decision. Right? It's not even like you have to be perfect your whole life. Just choosing today, I'm going to do one additional thing good. Bam, you have just moved the entire world to the side of good. That's the power of the individual.
that's so true.
But we don't think of ourselves like that. We think, politicians have power, corporations have power. I don't have power. Yes, absolutely you do. All right, enough sermon. Chapter 1, Mishnah 7.
If a father and a son have seen the new moon, they should both go to Jerusalem, not that they can join together as witnesses, but so that if one of them is disqualified, the other may join with another witness.
All right, so in general, in Jewish law, two relatives cannot combine to be witnesses for an event, right? That's why, like, for example, for a ketubah, you can't have two brothers be the two witnesses. Not even just brothers of like the of the bride or groom,
Or the
but two
parents.
brothers of themselves, right? If I've like got two friends that are brothers of each other, they can't be the edim, the witnesses for my ketubah. Well, I'm already married, but they can't be the witnesses for any ketubah because we don't let a conspiracy of family members happen. But even though it's a father and son in this case, they both go to Jerusalem. They're both breaking Shabbat because maybe one of them will be disqualified, and then one of them can join with another witness, and now we have enough. So even though they can't do it just by themselves, between the two of them, we can find someone else to match them up with, and then we'll be good. So you don't let your kids stay home. Carry on.
Rabbi Shimon says that a father and son and all relatives are eligible to testify to the appearance of the new moon.
Right. So Rabbi Shimon was more expansive. He said, for the new moon, for Rosh Chodesh, yes, actually we do let relatives join together and add up to do testimony, because this is a special case. We wouldn't do it for a ketubah, we wouldn't do it for a contract, but for Rosh Chodesh, for the new moon, we will.
How far have they called relatives? Cousins are still relative for this?
Not for this purpose, no.
So it's only son, father, and siblings.
It's basically people you would inherit from. Is the general rule of thumb.
So grandfather and grandchildren can go because it doesn't go the heredity directly to the grandchild.
I would have to double check that, but I think you're right. Yes. Part 3.
Rabbi Yossi said it happened once that Tobias, the doctor, saw the new moon in Jerusalem along with his son and his freed slave.
Okay, so here we got an interesting combination. We've got Tobias, who presumably is just an adult, free Jewish man, not indentured to anyone. He sees it. His son, who is under the age of bar mitzvah, sees it, or who is perhaps over the age of bar mitzvah, but still his son, and his indentured servant see it. So you've got 3 witnesses, but 2 of them, the father-son combo and the unfreed indentured servant, their testimony would normally not be allowed. So do we have 2 witnesses that we can put together or not? Right? That's the conundrum. Part A.
The priest accepted his evidence and that of his son and disqualified his slave.
Okay, so the priests, which we'll come back to this in a second, the priest, which means the Kohanim, said, father and son, that's okay with us for Rosh Chodesh. What?
Even if he's not bar mitzvah?
It would have been bar mitzvah age, right? So 2 adults, but father and son is okay for the Kohanim. However, the Chachamim, the sages, in their court,
But when they appeared before the court, they accepted his evidence and that of his slave and disqualified his son.
but among the Chachamim, among the sages, the rabbis, they said, father and son don't combine. But even though we don't normally take testimony from an indentured servant because they're too easy to be forced to give untruthful testimony because they have a master who could force them, in this case of Rosh Chodesh, we will accept his testimony, but we won't accept the testimony of the son. So it's very interesting to see which the Kohanim prefer and which the Chachamim prefer. The Chachamim would rather have 2 independent people rather than father and son, and the Kohanim would rather have 2 people together rather than the slave. What this also points out, by the way, is that there was a rivalry, competition between the Kohanim and the Chachamim, among the sages, that the Kohanim did not always agree with the rulings of the rabbis, and the rabbis didn't always agree with the ruling of the sages. The rabbis won, by the way, spoiler alert, that in matters of Jewish law, the rabbis became, because of the meritocracy and because of the traditions they kept, they were a much more reliable source of Jewish law than the priestly class was. The priestly class had a bad history of being corrupted, and therefore it was not considered to be a reliable source of information. Not unreliable, but it was better to count on what the rabbis were teaching than what the Kohanim were.
But in general, a testimony from somebody who is not bar mitzvah was accepted.
No, in general, a child a testimony is not accepted.
So you have to be guilty.
Yes. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about testimony because we're on the topic. This again is going to look very familiar from Sanhedrin, and we're on Mishnah 8.
And these are they which are not qualified to be witnesses or judges: a dice player, a usurer, pigeon racers, or traffickers in seventh-year produce, and slaves.
Right. So in general, those people cannot be witnesses. So if someone comes and they say, what's your occupation? And they say professional gambler. Sorry.
Bye-bye.
Right. Now, is it because they're dishonest? Not necessarily. But it is because professional gamblers often have debts to people that would twist their arm to get the testimony they want. And so that means that they are unreliable, not because they're liars and cheats, they might be, but because they are often, and we can never know, they are often under an obligation to someone else, right? Under coercion. And the same thing with usurers and with pigeon racers.
What is a usurer?
Somebody who's a loan shark.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Who gives loans?
No, it gives loans with interest.
High interest.
Right. Well, actually, in Jewish law, for most of the types of loans that we would consider just sort of regular loans, you couldn't give with interest at all, ever. Not any interest.
But to the Gentiles.
To non-Jews, you could, yes, but because it was a form of tzedakah, right? You didn't give loans to have someone start a new factory in Thailand. You gave a loan so that somebody could plant their field or could buy a plow and be able to go on living. The idea of modern commercial loans is very, very different than what the rabbis were dealing with, which is why there's a whole different apparatus that does allow us to make those types of investments in businesses and corporations, because they're not technically loans. But somebody who was in the loan sharking business, they were considered unreliable. They had unclear obligations to other people.
But usurers are the people that give the money.
Yes.
Yeah.
So while they don't have any obligation with anyone, people have obligation to them.
Exactly.
But not.
My obligation to you is my debt. Right? Because let's say I loaned you $5,000. And let's say now there is an argument between you and Yerach in court over who had the car accident and who has to pay who. And I was a witness. Who do I want to win the case? You, because that way you can pay me back.
Yeah.
Right? So even though I've given you the money and you have a debt to me, I'm also have money resting on you, like a gambler. And so I need to make sure that you come out ahead in Torah law, and they are absolutely considered unreliable for that. If you're engaging in this kind of forbidden practice. Part 2.
This is the general rule. Any testimony for which a woman is not qualified, they too are not qualified.
Right, which means there are some special cases when we do take testimony from women, which, by the way, in the ancient world, the prohibition on women as witnesses also had to do with them being under the rule of their husbands. Yes. And therefore their testimony, or fathers or brothers, therefore their testimony was also considered to be possibly biased or coerced or forced. Yeah. And that was the reason, which is why, must be about 10 years ago now, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards did pass a tshuva that said that women could be eidim, but that has been very slow in its adoption. There are most places still, because of trying to keep connection to the broad Jewish world, still try to use only male witnesses, which some of you in this room will know. Like when I do a conversion, I still use male witnesses. When I do a ketubah, I still use male witnesses. Although I believe that the tshuva was very well done and correct, I know that many of my colleagues disagree, and I would prefer that our legal actions be recognized by as many other Jews as possible.
Why do they disagree?
Well, because
today it changed. Many times they won't earn more money than men.
Absolutely true, but the halakha is the halakha is the halakha, and they don't care about the reason for the halakha, and therefore they can't change that attitude.
But you can change the halakha according to the time.
Of course.
Adapted to the society.
You can change, but if you don't believe that you ought to change, then you don't change.
But in this case, you discriminate because the reality changed so much that many people they could be edim because they're independent, they have their salary and everything.
And there's every reason to trust their testimony. I know. And I agree, which is why, like I said, in principle, I agree with the tshuva. And if there was more support among just the conservative movement, I would be happy to use women edim in more places. But there isn't yet. And so I'm abiding by the greatest common denominator for at least my movement in order to try and make sure that our legal acts are recognized by the greatest number of other people. Because I wouldn't want anyone to ever go to a new community and show their conversion certificate or a wedding, the ketubah, and have the rabbi there say, what do you mean Sarah witnessed it? Yeah. So, yes. So I agree with the halakha, but in practice, it's hard to change by yourself because, the witnesses are precisely to be used for other people outside of the community. All right. And now our last Mishnah. We're going to finish right at 8.
Wow.
I thought we'd finish chapter 1 today. So,
If one who has seen the new moon and is not able to walk to Jerusalem on foot, he may be brought on a donkey or even a litter on Shabbat.
right. So even like a palanquin, guys carrying you, in the box, even though it's on Shabbat, you got like other people to work to carry you or a donkey to carry. That's kosher. Even on Shabbat for Rosh Chodesh, for the new moon. That's how far the rabbis were willing to go in order to make sure we knew exactly when the moon came. And they go further.
If they, the witnesses, are likely to be attacked, they may take sticks to defend themselves.
You can arm yourself on Shabbat and carry this stick as you're walking along, which again, normally you would never do that. And even more.
If the distance is great to Jerusalem, they may take provisions with them, since for as much as a night and a day's journey, they were allowed to profane Shabbat and go out to testify concerning the new moon.
All right, we'll get the proof text in just a second. But the basic idea is you can even bring your food and water, right? Load up your backpack if it's too far. You can't get there on one day's belly. Fine, load it up. You're carrying your food. You've got your stick in your hand and you're riding a donkey. It doesn't look like Shabbat anymore, but this is what's needed in order to get the message as quickly as possible to Jerusalem so they can be declared. Why does it have to be as quickly as possible? Why not just do it Sunday, right? Do it the next day.
Too late.
Well, this is where they have the Midrash to try and prove it. And so this is Leviticus 23, verse 4.
These are the appointed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times.
All right, so the kicker here is that redundancy of appointed times at the appointed time. Not you will make the appointed time proclaimed tomorrow, right? You proclaim the appointed time when the appointed time is happening. So if the appointed time is happening on Shabbat, then you walk across Shabbat in order to proclaim it at the appointed time, because that's what the Torah commanded us to do. Said, do it at the right time, not later. One of the more interesting discussions that I had in rabbinic school was with one of our professors. It was a rabbi at a local synagogue in Los Angeles. And he was telling the story of his own family, that they would always get together every year for Hanukkah as like one big family Hanukkah party for one of the nights of Hanukkah. And one year he said, it was just crazy, and there was no way to get everybody together until the week after Hanukkah. So everybody got together the week after Hanukkah, and they were all together. And somebody said, well, if we're all together, we should at least light the menorah too. And he said, but Hanukkah was last week, right? It's over. And the person said, yeah, but we always light the menorah when we get together in December. And he said, but Hanukkah was last week. It's over, right? The time that we were meant to do that is gone. We can't say Asher Kedishanu for an event that's already passed. And so he ended up in the kitchen while they all lit the menorah, right? Because they really wanted to have that family moment of lighting the menorah and being together. And for them, that was what was important. And as he had to say, I can't say amen. I can't do this when it's not the appointed time.
We saw the same issue in Sukkot.
Mm-hmm.
When we learned the Masechet Sukkot also about when
Yes.
there's a storm or something.
Exactly.
It must be in that day.
You don't get a makeup.
You cannot do a blessing.
Right. If it's not actually on that day, then it's not that day. And that's you know, one of the real lessons of Judaism is to try and squeeze us into the right shape and right time of what the Torah has asked us to do, even when it's inconvenient or even when it's uncomfortable or even if it means we miss something. It's like, okay, we missed it. I guess we don't get to do the menorah together as a family this year. So next year we plan it earlier, right? So next year we try harder, not, we just do a makeup whenever we feel like it. That's where you begin to lose sight of what it was you were working together to make happen. And although, yes, it's lovely that his family still wanted the menorah and still wanted the light for being together, I would be willing to guess that over the long course, if that's the decision you make every year, pretty soon you're not going to be getting together so much. Because after all, like we talked about before, if it doesn't need to be on that day, then why couldn't it be more convenient, right? If they don't need me then because we have choices, then let's do it in January because, you know, it's a lot less busy around that time. And the airfares are a lot cheaper. And you end up with everybody making their own decisions and no one feeling that they're needed at a particular point to do a certain thing. And then it fizzles out.
It's so true.
All right, but you're here. So many of our people are here every week, week in, week out. Clearly, we've got a good group of people that are not doing that. But it's important to keep in the back of the mind every time you think to yourself, boy, I wish I could just sleep in.
Fine.
Yes.